right, welcome back, everyone. So, some stories coming out now that actually confirm what a lot of what we have been suspecting for a while now. Which it seems that when the pandemic COVID-19 is entering its end game state of the endemic, uh, meaning essentially that it's a permanent virus. It's going to be a seasonal flu. But folks, as part of this, something else is coming out now that a lot of people also suspected that with the endemic phase of this, where this again becomes part of a seasonal flu every year, it doesn't go away, they're going to have indefinite revaccination. Now, this comes from a discussion of the Pfizer top executives talking to their investors. I'll be explaining what's going on with this, folks, tell you about it. Also in New York, they're talking about now possible laws, bills they're trying to pass right now that will allow them to arrest and even can detain. They're maybe not in prisons, but in COVID facilities or ones like this, be able to detain the unvaccinated or anybody else that they say is a threat to public health. Now, they're saying, of course, that it's a 60-day imprisonment, whatever you want to call it, up to, but they have a stipulation in there that allows them to extend it basically indefinitely. Now, this is not yet passed, but I'll be explaining what's happening in New York with this and with some other things. And also, folks, Biden is now warning of the, quote, winter of death that is now upon us. But despite some of the discussions they're having with it, despite what the White House is saying, the data actually doesn't support some of the statements they're making. I'm going to be showing you both the statements and the data. That said, folks, you might say I got a Christmas tree finally. It's hard to find big trees now. I got a decent sized one, so it's nice. My daughter was happy; she actually decorated it. Folks, merry early Christmas. I'll keep you all updated as we go forward with that as well. But folks, great seeing y'all here. Yeah, always a pleasure. If you can also, again, we're going to be launching a new YouTube channel. Well, we have a new YouTube channel, which is Crossroads Highlights. We're going to see about trying to move things over to that channel eventually because, well, we're demonetized here. There's no light at the end of the tunnel. We're probably going to stay demonetized and stay frozen on this channel. So to kind of breathe life into this channel once more, we're going to migrate things over to Crossroads Highlights. Those of you on Epic TV, thank you for your support again. Those of you on YouTube, if you can, please like, subscribe to Crossroads Highlights. And again, eventually we're going to try to move things over there. All right, folks, that said, let's jump to the first stories. Yeah, thank you all. Also, Merry Christmas as well. Catherine, Zoogeist, everyone, thank you. Oh, Shannon Haney said, Josh, your interview with the Chinese virologist was amazing. Yeah, I'll be getting into that later, too. I sat down for an interview with Dr. Li Mengyan. She's the whistleblower from China. She was a virologist working out of Hong Kong, and she details how she was threatened by the CCP, how others like her are being threatened. She believes they made attempts to kill her. She also discussed some of the CCP's biowarfare programs. I'll be talking about this as well. But that said, folks, let's jump into the first story for the night. So first off, COVID-19, as people have been suspecting for a while, is very likely beyond the pandemic stage, and we're entering the endemic stage. In other words, the stage where it goes from being like an outbreak that is temporary to being something that's kind of permanent. This is endemic. This is a seasonal flu. This is part of the seasonal flu, essentially, that every winter we're probably going to see, and every winter they might have a new vaccine for. But folks, they're also talking about with this ongoing policies and the possibility of indefinite, because they're not showing an end to it, revaccination, probably encouraged through policy. Let me explain. Now, Pfizer's top executives, including the CEO, they're now claiming that COVID-19 could become endemic by 2024, not far off. Also suggesting as well that, folks, if you were hoping that COVID-19 or the CCP virus might go away in 2022, probably is not going to happen. They're saying endemic by 2024. And even then, they're talking about ongoing policies 2024 and beyond. Now, in other words, again, the virus is likely here to stay. So does this mean that the social control policies are also here to stay? Well, folks, the wording in some articles already seem to be giving hints that this may be the case. CNBC says this article you're looking at right here. It says, quote, endemic means the coronavirus will not disappear, but rather will become a vaccinated, protected ailment like the flu. Something that forever, folks, will need to be vaccinated, protected. Let me explain. The Pfizer chief scientific officer, Mikael Dolsten, said, quote, it seems like over the next year or two, some regions will transition to an endemic model while other regions will continue in pandemic model. So you have a pandemic model and an endemic model. They believe some areas of the world, countries, states in the US, are going to be entering an endemic model, while many will still hold the pandemic model over the next 2 years. That means, again, if you think this winter, the winter of death, as the White House is calling it now, is the end of it, it's probably not going to be. They're talking about next year, they're talking about the year after, and they're talking about indefinitely beyond that. And they're giving advice to their investors, because this is Pfizer. Let me explain. They're giving information to their investors to anticipate this. Now it says, so what's the endemic model, folks? Again, as opposed to the pandemic model, CNBC gives us some ideas on what that might be. Nanette Cocero, the global president of Pfizer Vaccines, during an investor call, noted that, quote, Pfizer expects countries will prioritize annual revaccination. Annual revaccination, folks. That is from the global president of Pfizer Vaccines talking to investors. Again, this is a for-profit company that is, again, getting government money, a lot of government money, has over 70 investors within our own halls of Congress and other parts of our government, top leaders who are pulling the strings of policy, making a lot of money off it. And they're telling their investors, this is again the global president of Pfizer telling their investors that Pfizer expects countries will prioritize annual revaccination. Now, again, they've been talking about a few things. One of the big ones is whether they want to redefine what it means to be fully vaccinated. The implications of that, folks, is if they have lockdown policies where your freedom is determined whether or not you choose to get vaccinated, and they make this an annual thing, this basically means, again, that these policies are likely here to stay. This ties into another issue as well, which is, of course, when you're dealing with government powers and the expansion of government powers, the big question at the beginning of all this, and this was like a kind of a joke. What we thought it was a joke, right? A lot of people thought it was a joke. It turns out it wasn't a joke, where there was like a meme going around where it's like, this ring of power from Lord of the Rings, and the guys, they're saying throw it in the fire, and it's like the ring says government powers, additional government powers, and the guy says no, and it's like governments. We're at that stage, folks, because what's happening right now is that government now has determined that freedom is no longer something you're entitled to naturally. Freedom is something they've overtaken through policy. Freedom is now granted to you conditionally if you go through the processes, whatever it is, including things that get them money, like, for example, getting vaccinated, which taxpayer dollars are financing, right? Folks, is my camera blurry? If you mentioned the camera is blurry. I apologize if that's the case. We'll see what happens. It's fine on my end, but you never know sometimes. It's iffy sometimes. It's usually okay, but it's maybe just a bit iffy. One sec. Wonder if I can fix some things around. All right, we'll see what happens with it. But folks, yeah, again, the big issue you're having right now is whether governments choose to revoke that power, whether they choose to surrender those powers, because by surrendering those powers, they're then giving up, a lot of authority that they may never get back. It's very hard for them to get this level of power. And to give it up and not have it again is maybe something they don't want to have, depending on the local government, depending on the federal government, depending on international governments. Now, folks, That said, of course, let's jump into some more stories. We are still demonetized by YouTube. Luckily, though, we do have sponsors. Tonight's episode is brought to you by Secure. Over 155 million Americans were affected by data leaks in 2020. The average American had their personal data stolen about 4 times over the year. People get anxious because they can't protect their online data or their online activity. But now there's a new email and messenger app called Secure. That's Secur. Then give privacy and security for sending emails and messages. Secure's server and data center are hosted in Switzerland. And that's important, folks, because Switzerland has the strictest data privacy laws in the world. Secure is also the only private and secure email and messaging app that does not rely on big tech companies like Amazon, Google, or Microsoft, which means also it's not subject to the Intrusive Cloud Act. Secure does not ask for your phone number. It does not mine your data. It does not upload your contacts like all other applications of this type tend to do. Secure Messenger functions by adding people you know, then adding their secure numbers, and you can also chat with people who don't have it by sending them an invite. In this way, you're protected from hackers getting onto your phone, and you have full privacy while on the app. Now, folks, for Secure, it costs $5 for the Messenger or only $10 for the email and messenger package. You can visit secure.com today for a free 7-day trial, or you can use the promo code Joshua to get 25% off. And folks, big thanks out to Secure for sponsoring tonight's episode. Now, folks, with that being said, one of the big questions going forward is also, well, if governments are not going to give up their additional powers, some of them, maybe some of them will. If they don't give up their additional powers, will we see kind of a stasis mode where they just maintain things as they are, or is it going to get worse? Folks, as the Russian folks saying may go, the bad times are over. Worse times are now upon us. Because it seems that New York now wants to start arresting the unvaccinated. At least some of the laws are trying to get through suggest this. The New York Senate and Assembly could soon vote on what's called Bill A416 when legislative session begins again on January 5th. Now, just briefly, they've tried passing this bill previously. One's just like this. They've tried. It didn't go through. They're still trying, meaning there are people who really, really want this, even though it's hard for them to do. But folks, this bill would give the governor of New York and other delegates, including top members of their cabinet, of their administration, the right, they say, they have the right to remove and detain other people, restricting others of their rights based solely by issuing orders that only need to include the person's name or a reasonably specific description of the individuals or the groups that they want to target. Meaning, folks, you're going to have a bill that allows the governor and other top people in power to basically have anybody or any group detained on a whim. All they need to do is write the person's name or give a description of the individuals or the group that they want to have detained. And that's as simple as that. Essentially, a way to imprison just about anybody, and it's kind of indefinite. I'll explain this. A way to basically imprison anybody, essentially, without committing a crime. It can even be just potential threats. Someone who's not done anything, they can call it potential, and have them detained in facilities that do include COVID concentration camps, we're going to call them, or other facilities that they list. Now, this can result in detention in a medical facility or any other that they claim is appropriate. The National Pulse, article you can see on the right here, the National Pulse notes that while the bill claims to limit this detention to 60 days, it can also result in indefinite detention because it gives room to work in repeated cycles. Basically, you can have like a 90-day period where they review things and they can just keep repeating it. So they say there is a limit to it. They can't hold you longer than basically 3 months, but they have stipulations in there that let them extend that over and over and over again. Now, folks, there's also concern it could result in forced vaccination, that they can not only detain you, but they can force you to get medicated in different ways. Now, strictly speaking, this is not specifically about COVID-19, which means that they can do this to you if they suspect you have another type of virus or ailment, or you pose any kind of threat to public health. Maybe eventually this will be extended to public mental health or public, social health or something like that. The phrase public health can be interpreted in many ways, and not saying they're going to do that or they want to do that, but when you look at policies like this, you have to look at future possible interpretations of the language. There are people who might say that YouTube videos that go against the social interest of certain powers might be a threat to public health because they say it's damaging the social well-being of whatever policies they're trying to make, and if they believe their policies are socially beneficial, then obviously it's a threat to them. Oh, throw them in the gulag if that's the case, right? Now, folks, let me explain the stipulations here. It says there's also concern it could result in forced vaccination, as I was saying, since the bill states it will, quote, require an individual who has been exposed to or infected by a contagious disease. They don't specifically say COVID-19, just a contagious disease, to complete an appropriate prescribed course of treatment, preventative medicine, or vaccination. Meaning, folks, if you have any contagious disease, any disease they believe is contagious, whatever it is, maybe it's HIV, as National Pulse suggests, could be COVID-19, it could be the flu, could be any contagious disease, anything that is a contagious disease, then not only would they be able to detain you, not only would they be able to detain people who are in contact with you, not only would they be able to detain people who they may think can potentially become a threat in this regard, but they can also find ways to prescribe courses of treatment, whatever that may be, medication, or vaccination. And notice they put vaccination and medication separate from treatment. And treatment can go in a lot of different ways as well, folks. Now, reasons to detain someone are also very, very broad, since it includes people who can be, quote, potentially deemed a threat. And it also doesn't give specifics on any particular contagious disease that it would apply to. Now, it's important to note again, this is not yet approved. They're going to be voting on this January 5th. But folks, this is where the discussion is at. In New York, again, they've tried passing this before. They weren't able to do it. One's just like this. They're trying again, meaning there are folks in their government who really, really want to have this power. Now, again, the bill name for that is A416. Meanwhile, folks, New York is already looking to redefine the meaning of what it means to be unvaccinated. Because as we mentioned, as they look to make this is an endemic, and they're looking towards endemic policies. In other words, this may never go away. And if they believe that they should have these kinds of additional powers, expanding their authority even further, maybe that's the end game of the pandemic, the endemic, where you might have government with powers like this to throw anyone in essentially the gulag if they believe you're a threat to public health. Folks, the Epoch Times reports that New York Governor Kathy Hochul said that the state may soon change the definition of full vaccination to include the need for a booster shot. She said during a December 16 press briefing that, quote, at some point, we may have to determine that fully vaccinated means boosted as well, and we'll give people a sufficient time frame to make that happen. And she added this. She said, I'm just sending out the message now. Prepare for that. Meaning, folks, almost without a doubt, sorry. Meaning, folks, almost without a doubt, they're going to be doing this. Almost without a doubt, having your normal vaccination, sorry, meaning that if you've gone and you've gotten your 2 shots of Moderna or Pfizer or your 1 shot of Johnson & Johnson, that is no longer going to make you defined as having been vaccinated. If you're going to be vaccinated, meaning you have your freedoms back, at least temporarily, it means you're also getting your booster shots. And this is entering now not just local policy, they're pushing for it. Dr. Fauci's been talking about the same thing. Also, the White House is talking about this as well. And folks, in New York City right now, sorry, 1 sec. Those of you curious, by the way, I have Taiwanese oolong tea tonight. Now, folks, it seems right now that New York City is getting an early start on this. Because over the course of 2 nights, 10 people who were protesting the vaccine mandates have been arrested in New York City. The known arrests, the ones we know of course, took place when at least 10 people tried sitting at 2 restaurants in Queens. They refused to show proof of vaccination, and then they refused to leave when they tried to kick them out. They were charged with criminal trespassing and for refusing lawful orders. The individuals appeared to have done this in protest, meaning that they did it intentionally for the protest element. And as they were released, they released also a flyer on the internet on December 15th suggesting they would go to the Cheesecake Factory for a similar protest. Folks, get this. They announced they were going to go to the Cheesecake Factory to protest. To go in the, you have 10 people, they're going to go there, they're not going to show their vaccination cards, and they're going to refuse to leave, right? What happens? This is in New York. The restaurant was closed for the night before they could get there. And the city in New York deployed at least 20 police officers and 5 police vehicles outside the restaurant. Folks, they had a stronger response to people wanting to go to the Cheesecake Factory without showing their vaccination cards than they did to like dealing with the BLM protests in New York, than they did to people like burning down restaurants in New York. They had a stronger response in many regards to that, to this recently than they did previously. And folks, keep in mind as well, they want to throw people in prison, in their camps or whatever it is like this, as they just did in New York. They want to throw them in jail for, not showing your COVID passport. But folks, these are the same officials pulling the strings on these policies who are the ones emptying the prisons. Remember, they were letting prisoners go ahead of the 2020 elections and, of course, the presidential elections, because they were claiming the prisons could become super spreader environments. Do you remember that? These are the same politicians, the same ones who were emptying our prisons in California, New York, and a few other places, the same ones who were doing that and making all this noise about, prisons were going to be super spreader events, are the ones arguing that people who they believe may be public health risks because they don't want to show their papers at, the local restaurant, they believe they should go to prison. They believe it's okay if they go to jail. But folks, all the people who were in for, whatever crimes, there were rapists, there were pretty serious charges people were in there for who got out, that they shouldn't be in prison because they may, get the virus and it may spread, right? These were also the same officials, remember, who did nothing and even encouraged the BLM protests at the same time, claiming the protests were more important than the pandemic. And, fine, if you believe in the protests, all power to you, fine. The issue, folks, is the government hypocrisy. Because remember, while they were telling everybody that if you go outside, you're going to, you're killing grandma, that you're going to be infecting people, that you're careless, it's a super spreader event if you go to a little like gathering, you can't meet with your family for Christmas. Remember, they're talking about all these things. These were the same officials who had no problem people standing shoulder to shoulder, oftentimes without face masks or protection of any kind during the early days of the pandemic, when most people still believed something real was going on. During that time, they did nothing about that. They did not care about it. They gave stand-on orders to police, and they stood by and let it happen. These are the same officials. The same officials then are the same ones now. And also, folks, well, with the exception of a couple like Cuomo and hopefully soon de Blasio, right? But also, folks, they're doing this in response to the Omicron variant of the virus, also known as the she variant. Remember, they changed the word, they skipped over she. Folks, this is the Omicron variant that is about as dangerous as Alec Baldwin, as I've discussed. If you're afraid of Alec Baldwin, you might be afraid of the Omicron variant because they're about just as deadly. Currently, right now, In terms of known deaths, again, you've had one death in the UK. They've now extended that to, they believe, 7 deaths only reported in the UK. And even then, they're not attributing that for sure that they died of the Omicron variant. They say people who had the Omicron variant died, meaning they might have died from something else. In other words, folks, this variant they're talking about right now, the data does not in any way justify the reaction they're having to it, which raises some questions on what is justifying these incredibly harsh policies. And again, let's talk about what the Biden administration is saying right now, because they're warning right now of a winter of death. And let me explain, I'll give you the exact information on that. And of course, as they're saying this, data coming out alongside these statements is suggesting otherwise. That this is probably, it seems, probably folks, well, becoming less severe rather than more severe based on the data alone. Again, we'll see what happens. Now, folks, with the Omicron or the She variant of the CCP virus now spreading, the world is being fed contradicting narratives. While the science is showing that very few deaths, and again, it's unclear how many people have actually died from it. The only reports of any deaths are coming out from the UK. They're saying 7, but the technicalities of that statement are, again, 7 people who have the virus or had the virus died. They're not saying they died of the virus, just to be clear. But folks, at the same time, medical officials in South Africa, where it originated, are repeating over and over that it's a mild illness. And we're seeing in other parts of the world that are dealing with this, that it's a mild illness, at least from the Omicron variant. But politicians in the United States and other parts of the world are warning about its severity while this is happening. The White House is now warning that, quote, for the unvaccinated, you're looking at a winter, this is a quote, for the unvaccinated, you're looking at a winter of severe illness and death for yourselves, your families, and the hospitals you may soon overwhelm. So they're saying essentially, folks, if you're not getting the vaccine, you're bringing death to yourself, your families, in the hospitals. And there are many people, of course, watching CNN and a lot of other news outlets who interpret people not getting vaccinated as representing this winter of death, so to speak. That quote is directly from the White House COVID-19 coordinator, Jeff Zients. The solution, they're claiming, if you want to avoid the winter of death, is to get booster shots. And folks, data, meanwhile, is raising questions whether the vaccines, let alone booster shots, are actually a solution to this. Because as we're seeing, folks, 1 vaccination didn't work. 2 vaccinations didn't work. They're now saying 3 vaccinations didn't work, even 2 shots and a booster shot. They're now saying 4 vaccinations is the way to go. And so it didn't, I mean, it's like they're playing a game with us, right? You have a disease. You have a disease and they create a medication for it. And they say, folks, good news. We now have a cure to the disease that's now spreading. Just take this medication, take the medication. It doesn't work. They say, well, it seems that the medication we gave you doesn't work. The solution to it not working is to take it again. People take the medication again and it still doesn't work. They say, well, it seems that didn't work. The solution is to do it again. And folks, people do it again and it doesn't work. And so what do? They say, well, just do it again. So if you understand the definition of insanity, this is the definition of insanity. You're doing the same thing over and over again, and you're expecting things to turn out differently. Folks, now on this, the solution they're claiming is to get these booster shots. I'll be going over some information on this because meanwhile, the data is raising questions over whether this actually works. Universities with near total vaccinations, and universities are a great testing ground for this because you have vaccine requirements at a lot of them. The data there is showing otherwise. You have universities with near total vaccination, like 99% vaccination, and they're still closing because they're having infections. You have cruise ships with total vaccination because they don't let you on otherwise. that are, again, having outbreaks. We can look at Harvard University, Stanford University, Cornell University. Data is being raised as well over the effectiveness of the booster shots. One example is Cornell. Joel Molina, vice president for university relations at Cornell University, said this in a statement. They said, and this is where they have 99% vaccination already. He said, quote, virtually every case of the Omicron variant to date has been found in fully vaccinated students, a portion of whom had also received a booster shot. Meaning the data does not show that this is going to prevent anything based on what we're seeing. Much of the concern is coming through the World Health Organization, if you're wondering where these concerns are originating, which claimed on December 17th that the Omicron variant spread doubles every day and a half to 3 days, which is faster than previous variants. And so this is the basis they're using to justify the panic around it. Now, regardless, the winter of death warnings from the White House are being compared to Biden's previous statements when he was still running for president against Trump. Now he's talking about the winter of death. Does anyone remember when he was talking about the dark winter last year? Last winter was the dark winter. This winter is the winter of death. Let me explain. In October 2020, Biden criticized then President Donald Trump of having no plan to stop what Biden was calling a coming, quote, dark winter. Biden said at the time this, he said, quote, 220,000 Americans dead. If you hear nothing else I say tonight, hear this. And Biden continued by stating, anyone who's responsible for that many deaths, and he was blaming Trump because Trump was president. He says, anyone who's responsible for that many deaths should not remain as president of the United States of America. Meanwhile, folks, in the 1 year since that speech, the 220,000 deaths allegedly under Trump have jumped to an alleged 799,421 under Biden. Under, again, Biden's statements that anyone who's responsible for that many deaths should not remain as president of the United States of America. And folks, meanwhile as well, questions are growing over where exactly the strongly worded warnings are coming from, because the White House is now talking about the winter of death. According to CNN, this is interesting, it looks like they're coming from people around Biden, not from him, but from people around him, including, guess who? Dr. Fauci. It reports that Biden, this is CNN, it reports that Biden had been sitting with his COVID response team and, quote, listened intently, I'm sure, as the officials laid out the contours of a looming coronavirus surge that could accelerate rapidly, swamp hospitals, and send the country into another bleak winter. It adds, however, that the Biden team also came to the evergreen bed-decked Roosevelt room with potentially more positive news. Many of those cases will remain mild or even asymptomatic in vaccinated people, particularly those who have gotten the booster shots. And they allegedly urged Biden to relay this to the public, which is where that came from. And meanwhile, it appears that Fauci, again, as Fauci is whispering in Biden's ear and telling him to do stuff like this, it appears that Fauci and his boss, his former boss, I should say, have been suppressing scientific findings. Suppressing scientific findings and suppressing scientists who contradict their claims. And there's documents on this from FOIA requests. The American Institute for Economic Research revealed that in early October 2020, it had hosted a small conference for scientists to discuss the virus lockdowns. 4 days later, Dr. Francis Collins, who is now retiring as head of the NIH, Fauci's boss, claimed that 3 of the scientists who attended this event were, quote, fringe epidemiologists. And again, Collins said that he said this in a directive he sent to Dr. Fauci and other senior staff at the NIH. Folks, on this, the American Institute for Economic Research discovered these messages through a FOIA request. I won't go over all of them, but they're worth reading if you're interested in this. And it notes that the scientists that Collins, Fauci's boss, that he was calling fringe, he was calling them fringe because they questioned whether the lockdowns were effective. That was the basis of that. And as we've seen now, the data has shown that the lockdowns in areas that have had them have done more poorly, have done worse than areas without the lockdowns, suggesting these fringe beliefs were actually the true ones, as seems to be the pattern we've been watching. Now, folks, I'm going to jump into questions in just a bit. So if you have questions, leave them in the chat. We'll try to get to them. But a couple points on this as well. I mean, what we're seeing right now is a lot of similarities to Australia because, again, they already have these policies that do allow for these COVID camps. Some people say, of course, that they're voluntary. You can go there. It's voluntary under threat of arrest and voluntary under threat of large fines that people could not afford to pay. In other words, it's voluntary as in, well, you can go peacefully or not peacefully, essentially, because they will throw you in a police car or they'll make you take what's called a COVID cab if you want to go to COVID camp. You don't have a choice to not go, but they're saying it's voluntary. And once you're there, you're not able to leave your porch. If you do cross the little line and go to the fence and try to talk to your friend, there were some videos of people talking about this at the camp. You'll have many doctors approach you and threaten to fine you large amounts of money if you do so. If you try to escape, as we saw several kids did escape COVID camp, they will have an actual manhunt to track you down and throw you back in. And then they will respond by giving an increased sentence at COVID camp. Many people in Australia's COVID camp are not actually infected with the virus, as different cases have shown. In fact, they do multiple tests there. The people who've been having issues have noted they do not have the virus. They've tested negative repeatedly. But folks, you also have something in Australia which is now starting here, which we've seen with Collins, Fauci's boss, which is that scientists and doctors are getting suppressed. In Australia, if you're a doctor and you disagree with the policies, you don't think they're scientific, you don't think they're medically sound, you can have your medical license revoked. If you're a scientist, you can face charges. In other words, is it science if you're punished for questioning something? Isn't this what they criticized? Like, when you were a kid, and you're learning about Galileo and looking at the stars, and he's held in front of these, this essentially Inquisition type scenario where he's being questioned about talking about the place of the Earth and the universe and stuff like this. That science, they used to claim, was being able to question things. Suddenly they're saying it's science to not question things. And if you question it, suddenly you can have your license revoked. You may even face charges. While they tell you at the same time, in the same breath, just trust the science. But as we've seen now that Fauci has declared that he is the science. So we now know what they actually mean by that. At the same time, folks, the winter of death claim, although again, we're dealing with a virus that is still mutating. We're dealing with a virus that is still mutating. Who knows what it may become? I'm not writing that off. But based on the current data on the Omicron variant, the data does not support the level of craziness these policies are going towards. And it also doesn't support evidence as well that the booster shots are actually stopping things. In fact, the data is suggesting otherwise. All right, folks, that said, let's jump into some questions. So if you do have questions, leave them in the chat. We'll try to get to them. Real quick as well, we do now have a new YouTube channel. If you haven't already, please like, subscribe, hit the notification bell. We want to move things over to there eventually. That's Crossroads Highlights. You can find it in the description below. You can also find it, of course, on the screen right now. That's ept.ms/Crossroads Highlights. And also, folks, we have Epic TV, and a lot of you are watching Epic TV as well, so thank you for your support. If you want to support Crossroads, a great way to do that. Tell people about the channel. Tell them about Epic TV. It really helps us get the word out there. Now, folks, I did a recent interview you might like to watch. The full thing's exclusively on Epic TV, but it's an interview with Dr. Li Meng Yan. You might remember her. She was a whistleblower. She was a virologist at one of these virus labs in China. She worked specifically at one of the virus labs in Hong Kong. And when she found information of how the Chinese military was cooperating with these labs, when she saw that they were working to cover up a lot of what was happening there, she defected to the United States and she became a whistleblower. Now, I had her on Crossroads just the other day talking about exactly what has been happening since then, because she's saying the CCP has threatened her multiple times, saying they can make her disappear even on U.S. soil. She claims they tried killing her as well. And she also details information that she goes over on Chinese military documents from the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, specifically on biowarfare weapons, bioweapons, and how they want in their own documents, in the CCP's own military documents, which are publicly available, how they talked about their intent and the benefits of doing so, of using a virus, of using a bioweapon in this case, not to kill off a population. They talked about that as well, but to destroy the social order, to destroy the social fabric of a country, and also to use it to destroy the economy of a targeted country. A bioweapon designed to destroy social order and foreign economies. Now, let me show you a quick trailer now of the interview we had. And again, folks, that's exclusively, the full thing is on Epic TV, epochtv.com/crossroads. I'll show you now.
I'm revealing the truth of the COVID-19. Chinese government want me to disappear forever, of course. Chinese government doesn't want people to know this because later on you see that they managed to let this spread all over the world, become the pandemic.
You were one of the big whistleblowers to come out from China.
The Chinese Communist Party government, and then they cover up, they cause the pandemic, and also they get the benefit from this pandemic.
You've defected from China, you've put your life on the line. You've been doing a lot of research still, trying to uncover this whole issue and what's really happening.
The things I'm telling the world actually reveal the top confidential plans of the Chinese government.
All right, folks. Again, that's Dr. Li Mengyan. She was a virologist in Hong Kong, working, of course, at one of these virus laboratories, one of the ones we've been hearing so much about, and also having information on how the CCP is trying to cover things up, including silencing doctors. She's still part of large networks of these doctors and is able to get a lot of information out of China. And so she has some very interesting information for us, which, again, you can find on our Crossroads channel on Epic TV, epochtv.com/Crossroads. All right, folks, that's us. Jump into some questions. First up is from JND72. You said, with the appearances of variants, what happened to the original form of COVID? Has it disappeared? Okay, I don't know enough about viruses to give you a good answer, a definitive answer on this. What I can say is that we do know that multiple variants have been spreading simultaneously, which does raise a lot of issues in terms of the COVID test kits that determine, again, whether you have it or not, and whether the sensitivity can actually differentiate between one variant and the next. We've seen discrepancies on the integrity of these test kits and whether they can actually measure things like that. And so basically, for a long time, you did have multiple variants spreading. Different countries had different generations of the virus. You know, one area might have the first generation, second generation, third, fourth. They're saying fourth wave essentially right now in South Africa with Omicron. And so you do have different variants spreading. The issue you have is countries being able to differentiate one or the other based on the normal test kits most people use to make that determination. It's not clear. It seems like the way that it's being done politically is that once a new variant is announced, any infection is essentially interpreted as being under that variant, under that outbreak wave that they're having. And that's just kind of how politically it's being described, even if medically that may not be the case. And again, previously there were charts showing the different outbreaks in different countries, in which generation was most common, or which variant of the virus is most common. You don't really see charts like that anymore. All right, another question here from Dade Johnson. You said, question, Josh, with a possible takeover by the CCP on Taiwan and issues in eastern Ukraine, do you believe the Turkic Union will bring peace to a region with Turkey, Armenia, Azerbaijan, etc.? It's hard to say. The Chinese, okay, so briefly on this, the Chinese Communist Party is talking about taking over Taiwan. They're pushing very hard towards it. They're also looking to have a peaceful reunification, essentially, where they can bring Taiwan under the fold. Unfortunately, I mean, based on I have friends in Taiwan. They tell me a lot about what it's like socially there. One of the unfortunate realities you have is that while you do have a large number of people who very much oppose the CCP, who do not want to be aligned with the CCP, there are also many who, unfortunately, as well, just have this mentality of kind of like servitude. They like the idea of government, pretty much controlling everything for them, and for some reason, there are people who want that. And so you do have two parties in Taiwan, one of which, and ironically, under the Kuomintang, the KMT or the Kuomintang was the one that fought against the CCP and fled to Taiwan, island of Formosa, fled to Taiwan, and established the Taiwanese country and government, right? That party, ironically, has become more the pro-CCP one. And so there are people within that party who do want that. And the other idea, too, is they're not, the U.S. is not really fully committed to defend Taiwan. A lot of people who want to maintain Taiwanese independence and want to stand up against that, they're also hoping, and they've been hoping for a long time, the U.S. would do more than just supply them with some weapons, because they believe even then that they're getting supplied with like older weapons, not like current generation, real high-tech weapons, by U.S. standards, of course. And so Taiwan is in a rough position right now. Although really, if there were a war, Taiwan could give the CCP a pretty good run for its money. Japan's also talking about supporting Taiwan. Other countries are suggesting they might. And so we'll have to see where that goes. In eastern Ukraine right now, Russia is basically giving an ultimatum to NATO. Russia is basically telling NATO that, pretty much if they intervene, if they interfere, and Russia's lining up troops and its military along the border, if they intervene, it's going to be a war. Essentially, that's what they're claiming. At the same time, Russia is also hitting the natural gas lines into Europe, because they control the energy of Europe. And remember, that was warned about during the Obama administration. That was part of the whole issue you had with uranium one being this nuclear energy company that they sold to Russia. Remember, Hillary was involved with that. So I won't get into the whole thing. Basically, though, during the Obama administration, they had information that Russia was planning to use energy and a monopoly on energy as a way to basically control other countries. We now see the effects of it, where Russia has a monopoly on energy, and they're using it to basically mess with Europe. They can, limit the supply to mess with Europe during this critical time when they're threatening to invade and take over another country, essentially. Now, when it comes to the Turkic Union and Turkey, Armenia, Azerbaijan, the CCP actually has a lot of influence in these countries already. There's mixed support against the CCP. There's mixed support or people opposing the CCP, basically, when you get into a lot of these countries, because as they have the One Belt, One Road initiative, transportation lines going through these regions into Afghanistan and other countries, into Europe, into Pakistan. You have groups that are attacking those lines, especially a lot of terror groups. The CCP is having issues with these terror groups. The terror groups actually have a lot of grassroots support in a lot of these countries. And as they're attacking these lines, the CCP is asking the countries, because it doesn't want to get involved in a terror war itself, to go and attack these groups. And so it's one of these other issues, again, where they're trying to pit the government against the people to deal with the issue on their behalf. And doing so is not winning them a lot of favor on the grassroots level. It's mixed. So basically, when it comes to the Turkic region, the CCP is trying to kind of subdue these countries as it is. Whether or not they could do that and maintain stability, we'll have to see. Already we're seeing the impact of this in Afghanistan, where the Taliban is actually asking for international support because they're saying they're risking mass starvation. And the CCP, of course, was the country the Taliban sided with diplomatically. The only country, if not one of the few, that was able to maintain a diplomatic mission in Afghanistan. And so we can see now what the CCP represents with this. At the same time, the CCP's genocide, and it is defined as a genocide now, against the Uyghur Muslims in East Turkestan, also known as Xinjiang. where they're using slave labor and so on, is not winning the CCP a lot of favor in Muslim countries. And a lot of them are starting to push back based on this. In fact, I have a friend in the UK who was telling me a lot of the mosques have begun protesting against the CCP because of the genocide of Uyghur Muslims. Yeah, Amar, if you're watching, you're good, man. All right, another question here from Seymour Butts, a good friend. He said, Josh, we know that the CIA, FBI, and other government agencies have paid journalists to help promote their agenda. This is true, actually. Have you ever been asked to do this, and what would you do if asked? I've never been asked knowingly by the FBI or CIA or any groups. I have received emails in the past asking me to write articles, and they want to pay me for it. I just gave them a hard no back, so I didn't explore further in terms of what these groups were or anything like that. But I have received requests in the past for that. I denied them too quickly to figure out what the groups were that were asking for it. But yeah, that does happen. There are groups, especially as media start getting larger, that they'll email individual journalists and they'll ask them to report on something, and they'll offer a compensation for doing it. Again, I don't know how widespread it is. I have received emails like that. If I even bother to respond, it's a hard no. I haven't received many, actually. But again, I never inquired far enough to actually figure out what the groups were. I can only assume that does happen on a larger scale, though. I don't know how large of a scale, but we do know that there were cases where government, federal agencies have had things like this exposed, where they were paying journalists. What is it Operation Mockingbird or whatever, things like this, where they talk about this. And you also have a lot of former intel agency guys going into these organizations, which raises a lot of concerns. People believe that a lot of them may in fact be government assets working in these news agencies. Under the Obama administration, they actually changed some laws around, which does allow some degree of cooperation with media organizations to conduct propaganda operations like that. At the same time, and this is something I think that I've been wanting to investigate for a long time, and I think warrants serious investigation. Does anybody remember the Countering Disinformation Act? That was under Obama. The Countering Disinformation Act. Let me explain what that was. Under the Obama administration, they created a government fund that would finance organizations to be able to counter disinformation or misinformation. Things they defined as that, at least. In other words, to finance fact-checker organizations. Part of that move to finance these fact-checker organizations was to, again, create funds and begin working with different media organizations and so on. There was never really any follow-up reporting on that after it was announced. But soon after that was announced, you did start having these fact-checker organizations popping up all over the place under all these different news agencies, under different social media groups, and so on. It's not clear whether they're getting government money to do that, but there was a government fund created to do exactly that right before that happened, that had descriptions of those exact operations as such. Keep in mind as well that Facebook, in a recent court, they're on trial for some of this stuff. In a courtroom, actually said they admitted that their fact checkers are actually opinion, and so they do state that their facts are not actually facts; they're opinion. At the same time, in addition to this, remember that, call it, who know whether you call it propaganda or medical advertising or whatever. There were also cases as well of different government agencies offering money to YouTube influencers and other social media influencers, I believe with 5,000 to 100,000 followers, where they were offering financial compensation in order to support some of the COVID-19 policies. And so they were doing this as well. At the same time, a lot of these fact-check organizations have a lot of ties to China. National Pulse has had some great reporting on this. And so you do have a lot of these weird things going on with information operations and so on. And there were several policies passed under the Obama administration made to expand that, which I believe warrants further investigation. but it's a bit difficult to research, unfortunately. We'll see what I can do, folks. Another question here from Gekromer. You said, why is so little coverage about graphite shortage that the CCP controls? Is it a national security issue that puts us in jeopardy? Yes. Is it graphite or graphene? Graphite, maybe. The CCP actually has a monopoly on a lot of different things, including like key medical ingredients, including smaller components used on microchips and so on, like that, motherboards and so on. There's been a lot of different levels to this because they've actually found a lot of security issues with the CCP in this regard in the past. Rare earth minerals being one of the big ones. Remember that when the CCP began launching its incursions into the South and East China Seas, especially over the Diaoyu or the Senkaku Islands, which are Japan owns them, the CCP claims ownership over them. When the CCP began claiming ownership over them, created an ADIZ, which is basically like a no-fly zone, military no-fly zone. One of the moves they first did at that time was they cut off the supply of rare earth minerals to Japan. That caused panic because the entire Japanese high-tech industry, a large part of their economy, was suddenly cut off. And they found that the CCP, if it has a monopoly on things like this, and folks, they have a monopoly on a lot of things, even like components used in solar panels. Ironically, a lot of it made allegedly through like some parts of it made through slave labor and so on. They found that raised some alarms at that time because they found that during time of war or even threat of war or even a diplomatic dispute, that the CCP could cut off the supply of key goods during a crucial time that could severely damage another country. And they started realizing, oh man, how could this affect us militarily if we're dependent on certain military components and suddenly we're not able to have those supply chains? There were reviews of this under Obama and under Trump, where they tried to fix the supply chain issues. It doesn't appear this was ever fully resolved. On the rare earth mineral element of this, there have been attempts to build rare earth mineral mines in the United States. Actually, interestingly, it's actually Republicans who've been blocking that. And, I know you hear the Democrats blocking a lot of stuff, national defense type stuff oftentimes. Actually, the Republicans have been blocking that because part of the contract goes to an Australian company, mining company, and they've been arguing that it should be an American company, not an Australian company, to get such a large investment, which, take it for what you like, right? And so it's mixed on that as well. Yeah, basically the CCP controls a lot of things. We also saw this during the pandemic where the CCP had a monopoly on medical equipment. And remember the PPE argument, personal protective equipment argument, and the CCP was doing what they called mask diplomacy. A lot of articles on mask diplomacy. The CCP was using its monopoly on face masks and medical equipment, protective equipment, as a diplomatic tool in order to get countries to basically bow down to its policies. We saw the CCP do that. They've made threats against the United States during the time in the early days of the outbreak where people didn't know what we were up against. And they had articles even stating they would throw America into the deep sea of the coronavirus by restricting its access to medical equipment. That was another example even recently of how that turned out when they're able to have monopolies on key goods that, again, they can restrict at key times. All right, folks, it's getting late, so I won't go over more questions. But before it's over, I want to go over one more story because there's one I wanted to talk about before because it's a bit bizarre. One thing that we've seen over the past really couple years is the news is so wild that sometimes really big things happen that would, under normal circumstances, be like the biggest story in the country, and nobody notices. Nobody notices because there's so much other stuff to be paying attention to. One of the big ones, get this. There were JFK assassination files that have finally been declassified, and they're showing evidence that the Soviet Union may have facilitated it. And I found the information on this very interesting based on the documents that were released because it actually substantiates claims from an author I like who's no longer, he died just recently actually, Ion Mihai Pacepa, who is, I believe, the highest ranking Soviet bloc defector to the West. I believe he was a 3 or 4 star general. He worked under Ceausescu in Romania, and specifically he worked on disinformation operations, running things just like this, and he actually explained this specifically. Now, just briefly, folks, again, classified documents of the JFK assassination have been finally released, and they show, this is Daily Mail reporting, they show that Lee Harvey Oswald, who is, again, the guy who was accused and later killed himself, accused of assassinating JFK, that Lee Harvey Oswald was in contact with KGB agents 2 months before the assassination, and that the CIA had information that the Soviets were planning to pay a hitman $100,000 to kill JFK, I believe a year ahead of the actual assassination. Now, what is interesting here, based on these new documents, is this actually aligns with claims from the late Ion Mihai Pacepa, again, who was a general in communist Romania, defected to the West and released a lot of documents and information on this. Now, Ion Mihai Pacepa explained in his book, which was called Disinformation, that the Soviets did this, that they did exactly actually what this document state, that they basically were in contact with Lee Harvey Oswald. I won't get into the details of it. But basically, they were in contact with him. But he said they put the U.S. in kind of a checkmate. They put the U.S. in a checkmate because the United States could not admit publicly that that it would be a major wage. It could be basically if the U.S. said, okay, yeah, the Soviets killed the president. If they said that, it would mean basically that they would be expected to either retaliate or not retaliate. They were not willing to retaliate. They were not willing to risk, global nuclear war over this. And so by not doing that, it would again basically be a major blow to the US and the entire Cold War. So they were put in a checkmate where they had to basically cover it up. According to Ion Mihai Pacepa, it was the perfect move. Again, and it showed also that if they did make it public without retaliating, it would show the Soviets could even kill the president of the United States without facing retaliation. According to Pacepa, that was the case at least. Take it for what it's worth, of course. We don't have all the documents yet, but based on the new documents that have been released, this is what they suggest, and they corroborate claims from, again, one of the highest-ranking Soviet bloc defectors at the time. All right, folks, that said, it's getting late, so I won't go over more stories. Always a pleasure. Again, I finally got a Christmas tree. Merry Christmas. It's coming up pretty soon on us. Folks, always a lot of stories to talk about. I'm going to be doing these lives every Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday. Again, 10:30 p.m. Eastern time. I'm looking to kind of make this channel better too. I'm looking to do more reporting, less like newscasting. You know what I mean? And so I'm working, of course, a lot on investigative projects. I have some big stuff to announce, hopefully soon for you all. Trying to roll these out quick. I've been traveling a lot, as you've been seeing. I'm probably traveling more, as you will be seeing. And some good stuff in the works. I'll keep you all updated on some changes I'm thinking about, how to make things better here and really kind of get in the field again. That said, folks, we have a lot of great shows already. I've started doing the interviews again. Again, one of the recent ones is Dr. Li Meng Yan. That's exclusively on Epic TV, at least the full one. They probably deleted it on YouTube anyways. But folks, we also have Epic TV, again, which is our uncensored video platform, video on demand platform. Crossroads is there. A lot of other channels are there. Those of you watching the show there, thank you for your support. You might want to check out one of our real good ones I've been saying for a while, which is Shen Yun Creations, something positive in your life, especially if you want some nice music for the holidays. Shen Yun is a New York-based performing arts company. They've been restoring the culture the Chinese Communist Party has been trying to destroy, which is why the CCP actually tries even getting their shows canceled all over the world, including calling up theaters in the US to try to cancel the show. It's fantastic music, fantastic dance. I'll show you a trailer at the end of this video of one of the recent episodes there. Nice orchestra music. Again, if you want some nice music in your life, be sure to check it out. Folks, that said, as always, please take care of yourselves, stay informed, and stay free. Thank you.